Welcome back to another episode of Flying Upstream. In alignment with this month's theme of energy healing, today's guest reminds us that sharing your feelings is not a weakness, it's a path to deeper strength. As a man who has bravely chosen vulnerability in the face of unimaginable loss, he's here to show us the power of love and how it can guide us through the emotional terrain of grief, death, and trauma. Today's guest is a devoted husband and father whose life was profoundly shaped by parenting two children with multiple, and in some cases rare, physical and mental disabilities. For 12 years, he was a full time stay at home dad until the unimaginable happened. His son passed away suddenly on January 28th, 2022, due to complications related to his unique needs. In the wake of that loss, he created Letters to Zachary, a website, Facebook page, and online community that chronicles his raw and unfiltered grief journey from a father's perspective. It's become a powerful space where men are encouraged to express their vulnerability, where women can better understand and support the grieving men in their lives, and where all who are grieving can find connection and compassion. Please welcome a voice of courage, vulnerability, and deep love, Jason Tuttle.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. We're so honored you're here, Jason. So I love your message. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to ground this conversation in what grief really is. It's not just about sadness, it's a full body, heart
Mhm,
deep process of adjusting to a new reality after
mhm,
a loss. And it shows up in waves and sometimes in silence. It's not linear, it certainly
mhm.
doesn't come with a timeline. Help us understand what grief really means.
You know, um, Grief in its most simplistic form to me is it's kind of a life readjustment. To give you an example, when I was a stay at home father, I was 24/7, 365 care for my kids. That is all I did. That was what my life was consumed with. And then after my son passed away, I went from doing things all the time, all hours, even hospital stays, doctor's visits, that kind of thing, to literally nothing. Because of my two kids, my son was the more medically fragile of them. And so for a while there, right afterwards, I went from my whole identity was my kids and their care and all the medical stuff that we dealt with to I had a ton of free time. And now what do I do with myself? So I had to over time learn to kind of readjust what my position was, who I was after I'd lost my son.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's so beautiful the way that you phrased it too, because grief is a form of love with nowhere to go. And
Hmm.
healing doesn't mean forgetting. It
Hmm.
means integrating and honoring and finding ways to keep
Yeah,
living with meaning even after loss.
certainly. Um, grief, grief in at least as it relates to me was. It was certainly trying to understand a wealth of emotion that was hitting me all at once. As you stated in kind of your opening statement, grief is it's not linear, it's fluid. Meaning, we all read about the 5 stages of grief, and it's not like I go through the first stage, I'm done with it, I move on to the second stage, I'm done with it, I move on to the third stage. Uh, at least from my perspective as a father, I mean, of the 5 stages, it could be 1 through 5, but then on the next day, it could be 4, 2, 5, 3, 1, 4, 1, 3, 2. I mean, it changes, and it changed a lot, at least in that first 6 months to a year of what it was. Now, granted, as a man, typically our first response is usually anger. That's just kind of the go-to first response for most men.
I I can appreciate that, and I would imagine to some degree that is what society has taught
Mm,
men and
certainly.
boys, that you get angry, you protect your family.
Mhm,
And what do you think that people kind of misunderstand about grief? Like, so you're saying for men, their first instinct
mhm.
is typically to get angry. but there's a lot more that comes with it.
There is. As crazy as it sounds, and most people would probably say, I can't believe that people would think that. But even still, in this day and age, a lot of people think that there's almost a time limit on it, as if to say, well, you lost your significant other on this day, and 2 months down the road, you should be finished with it and we move on from it. But that's not the case at all. Grief is a lifelong journey. Now, granted, on the spectrum of grief, in the beginning, kind of the visual that we all get in the beginning is, you're in an ocean, and at the start of your grief journey, you're almost in a hurricane where the waves of grief are just battering you, and it's keeping you under the water, and you can't get up to the top for a breath of air, and it's like you don't know how you're going to survive it. But after a certain amount of time, what happens is at least that first wave of it runs by you, and you kind of get in the center of the hurricane where you've got a moment to kind of catch your breath and breathe, and what am I doing, and how am I going to move forward, and how am I going to adjust to this? And then you get kind of that second wave, or for a lot of us, third and fourth waves. But eventually at some point you get to where the duration in between the waves becomes a little bit longer and a little bit longer, until it gets where it's manageable and bearable, at least in that first year.
Hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense. In some ways, it's getting used to grieving, which
Hmm.
is, I imagine, new for a lot of people. Um, and in some ways, that becomes the new norm. We don't want that to
Hmm.
stay the norm
Hmm.
forever, but that is the new norm. And as you said, it's readjusting to a totally different life. And while you have that one person who is grieving and being
Hmm.
hit again and again, what can people around them say or do to support someone who is really right in the thick of it?
That's the question still to this day I get pretty often. And you know we are taught as just general civility, if you will, when it comes to people that in your life, especially maybe friends that have lost loved ones, is we need to be there for them, but we need to say something. We need to offer up advice, and that's not necessarily the case at all. 99% of your grievers, all they're really looking for is for that person outside of the grief just to reach out. Now, we may say no every time you reach out to say, well, do you want to go out to lunch? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? Just to kind of get our mind off of it. And a lot of us, most of the time, will probably say no, but make no mistake about it, we do appreciate the effort. And a lot of times I tell people, your griever, most of the time, or if not all the time, doesn't necessarily want advice. It's as simple as just sitting there with them. The analogy I typically give a lot of people is, a lot of grievers just want you to come sit in the dark with them. Even if you just sit there and don't say anything, it's the fact that you're there, not so much, offering up words of wisdom. And that's probably the biggest butting of heads, if you will, between grievers and non-grievers, is the fact that the non-grievers want to give up some wisdom and all that, and unbeknownst to them, a lot of times they'll say something that might strike a wrong chord in us, and that's not necessarily their fault, but sometimes less is more in these situations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know that what you're speaking of touches on something that uh, my daughter, who's in first grade now, is being taught in school. So
Mhm.
when somebody is upset for any reason, you
Mhm.
want to understand, do they need to be hugged? So do they
Mhm.
want some physical affection?
Mhm.
Heard? They just want you to listen to them, go on
Sure.
about it, or helped? They actually want
Mhm.
real advice. And I think that's so important because that dovetails perfectly with what you're saying, is that people don't always want advice.
Yeah.
which is what, again, we are taught, like, "Oh, we're fixers. I'm gonna help you. I'm gonna fix this for you. Like,
Mm-hmm.
no problem. Let's go out to lunch. Let's go get drinks. Let's go to the spa." Like,
Hmm.
the reality is, like, everybody is different. So every
Exactly.
person out there will have something totally different of what will help them. And
Hmm.
as a non-griever, it's critical that you are able to listen and try to tune into that. Otherwise,
Hmm.
as you said, you could be inadvertently doing more harm, even
Hmm.
though that's not your intention, right?
Oh, no, no, not at all. And even some of the things that have been said to me, most of the time, it honestly rolls off my back. I don't think much about it just because, grief and death are one of those things. Why would you deal with it until you're forced to deal with it? And that's a lot. That's where everybody that enters the grief life is kind of thrust into. Now I'm forced to deal with it because I've lost a loved one. And that right there is kind of where the disconnect comes from. And it's nobody's fault.
Right. Exactly. So so as you've gone on your journey, Jason,
Hmm.
and you have healed
Hmm.
bit by bit along the way,
Hmm.
what does healing actually look like when you're grieving, and how can we recognize it even in small moments?
Um, well, I mean, I can, at least from my perspective, healing during the grieving process. One of the things that I've done, which led to Letters to Zachary, was journaling and writing. I've always been one of those people that I may still have issues with whatever I'm dealing with, but if I can get it off of me and get it maybe on a page or somewhere else, then I can kind of set it to the side and maybe deal with it later versus all of it just kind of weighing down on me. And for me, doing the journaling that eventually led into Letters to Zachary, that's been a huge help when it comes to healing. Um, for other people, I mean, it could be the community between those people is what some people want. I didn't necessarily want that in the beginning. There's a lot of us, at least in that first 6 months, maybe even a year, you kind of get almost reclusive at some points because you just don't want to deal with other people and you don't necessarily want to deal with the questions and constantly talking about it and you know um just kind of having that part of it until you can finally get into kind of a better place with it. um Healing comes from community, in my opinion. And one of the things when I finally got to a point to do that was there's a lot of people in the grief community online that I've become close with and know. And, um, we've become close because we've been there, done that. We understand it. We've been right in the middle of it. And so, who better to kind of help you heal than someone that understands maybe not exactly what you're dealing with, but has a very good understanding of it?
Absolutely. And I know that your community is was initially focused on reaching out to men who are
Hmm.
grieving,
Exactly.
because our society tells men it is not okay to show your emotions. It's
Hmm.
not okay to grieve. You got to be angry, be that rock, right? So
Hmm.
tell us a little bit more about what the initial intention was of your Facebook group, your website, and how it has evolved to reach so many people.
Well, honestly, the running joke I tell people is the reason why I created Letters to Zachary was almost out of spite. And I say that because when I after my son had passed and the funeral and all kind of the funeral fanfare had passed, if you will, um, I got online to see if I could find groups. And you can find grief groups and you can find very specific grief groups on there. But I couldn't find any that were male centered. Probably 99% of them are female centered because, you know, characteristically is typically the female gender that's always known to be a little more on the emotional side, more free with their emotions, and I just couldn't find that. And even the groups that I got into, the small percentage of men that were in there um, weren't very active, and so all I was really looking for was maybe someone that knew exactly what I was dealing with, but was at least in kind of the ballpark. And I just couldn't find it. So that's what kind of led me to um, start the Facebook page Letters to Zachary and to try to invite men in there just to say, hey, if you're having an issue with this and you don't want to be vulnerable in front of women or others or however you feel about it, you can come on my page and that's okay, because I'm here to show you that it is okay to be able to be vulnerable, especially when, as a parent, you're dealing with the most devastating thing a parent can deal with in the loss of a child.
Absolutely. What hurdles would you say men face when they're trying to grieve openly and authentically?
Well, uh, I will say to in the beginning, a lot of it is comes from just a generational perspective, meaning I'm considered Generation X with the age that I am, and we are kind of the rub some dirt on it and walk it off generation, if you will. Uh, I was taught that all my life, whether that's good or bad, it's just what I was taught. I was always taught that if you are emotional, it's short, sweet, and to the point. It's not done in public, it's done in private. I mean, if there's people you feel comfortable around to do it, most likely, a mother, a girlfriend, a wife, that kind of thing, you can do it. But when it comes to being out in public, most men, even still probably today, although it is better today, um, we typically get, like in any job, when you have the loss of a loved one, you get 3 bereavement days, and that's typically for men. They'll give you the 3 days. You do what you need to do for those 3 days. You have your moments, all that, but at the end of those 3 days, it's back to work and you're back to producing. um, that's kind of what society has taught, definitely my generation, and maybe even still today. And you know while the 3 days is nice and it's helpful, that barely breaks the surface when it comes to dealing with an issue that's going to be the rest of your life. It just doesn't go away in 3 days. On the other hand, men from birth are taught that our value is based on what we physically bring and materialistically bring to the relationship. And a wounded man is not a productive man. And we have to be able to get around kind of the wounds that are created from this to go back to what society expects of us. And so that's a hurdle. Probably the other big hurdles are, and this is no fault of women. I tell women all the time when I make these comments, it's not a personal attack. I promise you it's not. But what I've grown up with is I have always been taught that the woman and her emotions, no matter what the issue, and especially as it relates to grief, is their emotions come first, period. And if there's anything left after that, if the man wants to open up about it, there's a very small amount of area and time where the man can open up. And I mean, I've had some women that have come out and said, well, no, that's not the case at all. And I say, okay, let me give you an example. The street I live on has 50 or 60 houses on it. And I guarantee you, I can go into the majority of those houses, and somewhere in that house, there's a picture on the wall in a frame that says "Happy Wife, Happy Life." And I say that is burned into our brains. And I said, there's nothing wrong with that. As a man, I love the fact that I can make my wife happy and that everything's good and kosher with her. But that subconsciously teaches man that if she's not happy, then there's no way I'm going to be happy. And it's always her first when this relationship is supposed to be the two of us versus the one of us. And so, all of those things combined, those are some of the things that men have to overcome just to start grieving if they choose to. And those are a lot of the hurdles. Um, the last thing I'll say is this: even in today's world, I've seen online in several occasions where I hear, well, all women want is a sensitive man. But the moment the man becomes sensitive, now I'm not saying overly sensitive and always crying. That's not what I'm saying. But the moment the man becomes sensitive about whatever issue, the man then gets insulted, ridiculed, talks, downplaying their manhood, all of these things. And even though men may not speak out about it, we hear it and we don't forget it. And we get to a point to where we're just like, if that's all you're going to do, I don't want to deal with you. I would rather be single than to deal with that all the time. Every time I do the very thing that you want me to do in this relationship.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I also just want to acknowledge the work that you have done to dig into so many of these unfortunate social norms.
Hmm.
I know it's so hard for a lot of people to understand that their upbringing,
Hmm.
while they may have a lot of love for their family and their family loves them, was not always ideal in the sense that it hasn't quite set us up for success emotionally as an adult.
Exactly.
Right. Absolutely. So, with all that said, men have their work cut out for them.
Mhm.
What do women need to understand about how men process this and express grief, and how can they support their partners in this journey?
Well, there's a couple of things. Well, first of all, men by general nature have learned throughout their entire lives, definitely my generation, we've learned to compartmentalize because we have learned that even though we may be dealing with something difficult, we still have to be the foundation. We still have to be the rock, if you will. We've got to be the one to make sure that the rest of the family is taken care of and better off somehow down the road. It's just, and most men like doing that. We like providing for our family, we like having that role. But when it comes to something like devastating loss and emotion, our priority first is yes, we'll deal with this, but we'll deal with it later. I've got to take care of you first. To give you a great example, the day that my son passed, I was actually in the ER trauma room the entire time they were working on him. I watched him from the moment he took his first breath that morning till the moment he took his last breath, and they pronounced him in that hospital. And so everything had happened. They gave me condolences, and the care team lady came up to me, and I literally looked at her. My son had 30 seconds ago died on a table in front of me, and I look at her and go, it's going to sound cold and callous, and I don't mean for it to be. And I point at my son and I go, I will deal with this in a minute, but I need to know answers. And I rattled off about 20 rapid fire questions at her to be able to do that. And the other example is my right after my son passed, I had a moment for a brief second. I regained my composure. I called his mother to tell her what was going on. I then called his grandmother to tell her what it was going on. And in the later on down the road, my mother asked me, she said, when you called me that day, how soon after he had passed did you call me? And I said, maybe 10 minutes. And she said, you were eerily and stoically calm in that moment, and your son had literally just died. And I said, well, I said, in that moment, I said, if I were a quote unquote blubbering idiot and I couldn't get the words out, then I needed to get information to y'all so y'all knew what was going on in that moment. And so that's kind of a guy's kind of mindset. Now, the thing I typically tell women a lot, and again, I preface it with this is not a personal attack. This is what I've grown up dealing with. This is what other men have told me. When a man comes up to you and if a man comes up to you and feels secure enough to open up and be vulnerable about something to you, if your first response as a woman to him is, I can't believe you're upset about that. Why is that bothering you? Why is this such an issue? Or some comment like that, they may not say something in that moment, but probably what a man's going to do is they're going to take that information and they may immediately get quiet in that moment. Now, they may come back again, but they won't forget that first moment. It's almost like a three strikes and you're out kind of scenario. We'll give you several attempts, but if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, it's eventually going to get to a point where we're just going to close down and we're not going to open up to you. And so you've got to kind of come into it with kid gloves in a sense. Um, I I tell women all the time. I said this is the big one that I typically get a lot of flack for when I do say it to women is when your man comes up to you, and I need you to listen, and I expect men to do this as well. When you're having a conversation, you need to listen and not listen to respond. I said, you've got to do that. I said, if you're waiting for the moment that I take a breath for you to insert your feelings about how my feelings are bothering you, all that tells me is my feelings don't matter. They will always be secondary to yours. And why am I going to open up if the way I feel is only going to make you jump back on me about how it's distraught you when these are my feelings? Is what I typically tell them. And I say that to both sides, not just to women. And then the last thing I'll say is if women expect their male significant other when they're talking to them to be quiet and listen to the whole thing so that they can either vent or maybe want help at the end of whatever they're saying, then men expect them to do the same thing. So if I'm saying something to you, I don't want you interrupting me. Now, when I'm done, sure, say whatever you want to say. And it goes back to if you're listening to respond and you're interrupting me every time I take a breath, then it's going to eventually get to where I'm going to get tired of it. So those are kind of the ballpark of things what a lot of guys deal with.
I can really appreciate what you're saying,
Mm,
and I can only speak for myself as a woman,
mhm,
but there is this sense of feeling like you have to always have an answer.
mhm,
And so I can understand what you're saying, where you maybe trying to, or men in general are trying to
mm,
explain their side, be vulnerable, open up about
mm,
their feelings, and the woman in their life is trying to jump in really
mhm,
quick. I can absolutely see that happening. And it is hard to be
mhm,
patient and to let somebody finish talking, especially when you
mhm.
really want to say something.
Yep.
So I definitely can see that and appreciate your advice to
Mhm,
just simply let the person finish talking, right?
mhm,
Even though it seems simple, seems easy, but when you're in that moment, can be very
mhm,
challenging. I
mhm,
appreciate that. And so as you've gone through your journey of
mhm.
moving through the grief and healing, how do you continue to honor your son's memory in your daily life, and how has it evolved over time?
Well, after I initially got through, I agreed pretty hard for probably a year and a half, which in my community, that's that's kind of the standard. And for a lot of people, that may be a little on the low end, but it took me about a year and a half to kind of get back to normal, if you will. And years ago when my son was born, I kind of got under the belief of instead of me complaining about the circumstances, that doesn't do any good. I need to do something about the circumstances. And after I'd kind of gotten through the tough grieving, I thought, well, I need to do something, one, to help me with my grieving process. And I also want to do something to create a legacy for my son. And that's kind of where Letters to Zachary came from. It was during a counseling session I'd had during that year and a half where the counselor said, have you ever thought about journaling? And the irony of that statement was in the beginning, I said, I don't know if that's really my thing. I don't know how good of a writer I am to like express myself. And so she gave me that idea and she said, well, you can put that on the back burner. And I did for 9 months. And then as the story goes, one day I was watching either a Facebook video or a reel. I don't even remember what the topic was on, but something in that reel when I watched it, just it gut punched me. And like I lost in that moment sitting in the house, like just blubbering, crying, kind of something that reminded me of my son. And I regained my composure and I literally just opened a Word document and in letter form, dear Zachary, and I just verbally vomited on a page. And I wrote exactly how I was feeling. If I felt like it needed to have an F bomb in there, that's what I wrote. And I did that several times a day for weeks. And then one of the Facebook groups I was in, it was a smaller grief group, and I got to know the female admin very well. And so I messaged her one day and I said, "Do you mind if I post one of my journal entries?" And almost before I could finish, she said, "Yes, we would love for you to." She said, "We either get no men in here or very few men willing to post something like that in the group, and we would all love to hear it." And I said, "Okay." And so I went to go copy and paste it. And for a brief moment, I paused because I thought, as noble as this is to do this from my perspective, it's still the internet. And am I in a headspace to be able to take on negative comments should I get them, and not like want to jump down someone's throat because they just don't understand, if you will. And so I still posted it, and I waited, didn't really get a response, and I waited and waited. And finally that evening, it blew up. Like, I got a massively positive response. And the one I'll never forget was this mother who had lost a child. She messaged me and goes, "We've never met. Our paths have never crossed. I've never told anybody close to me or anybody around me how I feel deep down inside. And I just read your letter, and it hits me word for word the entire letter." She said, "This is exactly how I feel." And she goes, I don't know how you did it, but she was just like, "This is me exactly." And so I said, "I appreciate that what I'm writing resonates with you." I said, "It's inspired by my son and just our relationship." And I said, I'm glad I could write something that you could connect with." And it was from that first letter that I continued posting, and when you get to a point where you're doing something that everybody likes, you start getting all the, "Have you thought about doing a podcast? Have you thought about writing a book? Have you?" And all of those things in that moment, I just wasn't in the headspace for. And so finally it got down to the page, and someone told me about it, and I thought, well, I can do that. And I created the page, and I reached out to a lot of the big names in the grief community, and I just said, "Hey, my name is so and so. I think I've got something here. I'm trying to grow it. Can you give me pointers of what worked well for you, what maybe I should steer away from?" And all of them, and I mean people that had 10,000 plus followers. And there was an author that had 1.6 million followers that said, "Yeah, if you want to do this, you're going to want to do A, B, and C. If you want to do this, you're going to want to do D, E, and F." And I said, I really appreciate the information." I said, "That really helps out." And once I did all those things, it just started growing leaps and bounds. And it has evolved to what it is today. So initially, it was just the Facebook page, Letters to Zachary. Well, then I opened up an Instagram page where instead of doing the writing, I could do memes and things. And then I decided that I wanted to do TikTok. And at my age, I'm really surprised I decided to do TikTok, but here I am. Because I wanted to do the short form videos, 2, 3 minutes tops, and then I could kind of get some interaction with it. And then after that, I was just like, well, if I want to do anything else, I need to create a professional website. So I created a professional website. And the last thing I did was I'm now published. I created a grief coloring book, um, just because I wanted something tangible that I could hold in my hands that was related to my son. And so that's kind of where I'm at this point.
That's beautiful. I know that it's been a journey for you,
Mm,
and it will be a journey
mm,
for going forward. And thank you
mm,
for inadvertently being a spokesperson
mhm.
for men going through grief. And unfortunately, we're winding down now a little bit. We've
Oh,
got one last question for you.
okay.
So, as you continue, how are you helping others find hope now that your understanding of it has changed since your loss?
I've always been a proponent of, when I need assistance or help, professionals are great with all the degrees on the wall, but I've been one of those people. I'm kind of a word of mouth kind of person, and I gravitate to more people. Yes, the professionals are wonderful and they've got their theory and they've got all that side of things, but I like talking to people that have actually been in the moment, that have been in the trenches, that have experienced it firsthand. And so, what I typically tell people is, especially for men, men are funny in the sense of none of us want to be first, but once we see someone do it and they're okay doing it, then you start getting the copycats. And so if I have to be that guinea pig to show other men that it's okay to occasionally open up and show your emotions, then so be it. I'll be that guinea pig, and to say, hey, I'm doing it. It's There's nothing detrimental has happened to me. I've got a pretty good following. If you're looking at that, the people like what I'm doing, come on over. You don't have to be public about it. You can direct message me if that's the route you want to go. But I'm here to show people that, you're not alone. It's not going to hurt you. Nothing bad's going to happen of it. But on the other hand, if you don't see the value of this and you hold it in all the time, either you're going to pay for it on the front end or you're going to pay for it on the back end. And with grief, it typically that comes out um, physical health. Um, I know people that, they hold their grief in, and, they get big into drinking or get big into sleeping around, or they get big into drugs. They do something to numb the situation. And I'm here to say, if you could just get the grief out and talk about it, there's a good chance you could detour from all those self-destructive behaviors.
So true. So
Mm,
true. And you clearly have a very good understanding of this. This
mm,
has been amazing, Jason. Thank you
mm.
so much for sharing your story with
Thank
such
you.
honesty and heart today.
Mhm,
Your courage reminds us that healing isn't about fixing what's broken, it's about learning to carry our grief in a way that honors both our love and our loss. And to our free spirits listening, there's no one right way to grieve, but we heal more fully when we don't do it alone. If you're
mhm.
looking for a space to feel seen, supported, and understood, I encourage you to join Jason's community, Letters to Zachary. Thanks for listening, free spirits. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and as always, keep